In the city of Gloucester, in the central part of England, there was a terraced house at 25 Cromwell Street. From the outside, it looked just like the other homes nearby. It had a tidy garden and a simple, ordinary look. There was nothing about it that seemed unusual. But inside the house, and directly beneath the patio that had been neatly maintained, something very disturbing was hidden. The body of a 16-year-old girl was found buried there. Her remains had been cut apart, and she had been placed in the ground in a deliberate, organized way. This discovery was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. As the truth came into focus, the case became widely known and was later referred to as the House of Horrors. Sometimes you look at people or a couple and they just seem pretty normal. Maybe they're a little rough around the edges, but nothing that would suggest they are purely, utterly evil. That, it turns out, was part of the trick with Frederick Walter West and Rosemary Pauline Letts, who were also known as Fred and Rose. What was behind their everyday appearance were secrets so deep and twisted that they would end up taking an incredibly large number of lives. To understand how they became known as the monsters of Cromwell Street, we need to go far back, right to the very start, to the terrible beginnings of their individual childhoods. Let's begin by talking about Fred West. He was born in Muchmarcle, Herefordshire, in 1941. By all accounts, Fred's early life was a very grim experience. His father, Walter West, worked as a farm laborer, and the family lived in a small house on a farm that was quite remote. This was definitely not a happy, ideal childhood in the countryside. Instead, Fred's childhood was marked by abuse and neglect, including severe physical and sexual abuse from his own mother. It's hard to even imagine that, isn't it? The person who is supposed to care for and protect you becomes the source of your deepest fear. This early, horrific trauma set a very disturbing precedent for Fred, making the boundaries of what was acceptable or even possible in human interactions unclear for him. He was also in a serious motorcycle accident when he was young, which resulted in a plate being placed in his skull. While this accident isn't directly considered the reason for his later actions, some people have thought about its possible effect on his mind, which was already troubled. Fred started showing behaviors that were deeply disturbing. He was known for being cruel to animals, which is a classic early warning sign often seen in people who later commit violent crimes against other humans. He also developed a fixation on sexual violence and control, especially when it came to younger girls. It was something that strongly influenced him, shaping his entire view on power, on who is vulnerable, and on the disturbing satisfaction he got from dominating others. It was almost as if, from his very first days, Fred was being prepared for something truly terrible, learning that control and violence were not just ways to do things, but perhaps the only way he understood how to navigate the world. Now let's turn our attention to Rosemary Pauline Letts, or Rose, as she became known. She was born in Northam, Devon in 1953. Rose's early life, much like Fred's, was anything but stable or filled with love. She was one of many children, and her family life was described as chaotic and abusive. Rose's father, Bill Letts, was a demanding and often violent man, and her relationship with her mother, Daisy, was full of tension. But it wasn't only a difficult home life. Rose was also subjected to sexual abuse, not by just one person, but by multiple individuals, including members of her own family. This pattern of being victimized repeatedly at an early age is very important for understanding what she did later. It's certainly not an excuse, not at all, but it is a piece of this terrible puzzle. She stopped going to school early, around the age of 15, and started seeking out older men. She was already showing a pattern of looking for attention and approval through sexual means. These experiences, along with a complete absence of a moral compass or empathy, began to solidify her own disturbed way of looking at the world. Both Fred and Rose, from their earliest years, were essentially taught a terrifying lesson in abuse, becoming like graduates from a school of cruelty, ready to inflict on others the very pain they had experienced themselves. Moving forward in time a bit, we get to the early parts of Fred West's adult acts of depravity. His first marriage was to Rena Costello. She was a few years older than him, and they got married in 1962. Together, they had 2 daughters, named Charmaine and Anna Maria. But even then, the dark currents that were inside Fred were clear. He was already involved in small crimes and violent attacks. His marriage to Rena was troubled, marked by Fred's increasing control and abuse. But the truly chilling escalation began with his first known murders. In 1967, Anne McFall, a young nanny who was working for the Wests and carrying his baby, disappeared. Fred was strongly connected to her disappearance, and it is believed that he was responsible for her death, burying her body in a field near his childhood home in Much Marcle. Then, in 1971, his wife, Rena Costello, also disappeared. It is a truly horrifying detail that Fred would go on to murder his own wife. He killed her, took her body apart, and buried her in a field near Much Marcle, which was the same remote place where Anne McFall's remains were found. He also murdered Charmaine, his own daughter, with Rena around the same time. He buried her body at 25 Midland Road, an address where they had lived for a short period. This created a very disturbing pattern of secrecy and hiding bodies in remote, secluded places. This early period firmly established Fred's way of operating, gaining ultimate control, then getting rid of any evidence, any witness, any obstacle, and then simply moving on, as if nothing at all had happened. It was during this dark time, after Rena and Charmaine were gone, that Rosemary Pauline Letts came into Fred's life. They met in 1969, when Rose was only 16 years old and Fred was 28. Rose was already very troubled, as we know, separated from her family and living in very uncertain circumstances. In many ways, she was an ideal victim for someone like Fred, vulnerable, looking for stability, and already accustomed to a world of violence and abuse. But here's the important point. Rose wasn't just a victim in the traditional sense. She quickly became an active participant, someone who willingly helped in the crimes. Their relationship was not built on love or affection, but on a shared understanding of deep wickedness, a mutual desire for control, and a twisted enjoyment of causing pain. They got married in 1972, and soon after, they made their home at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester. From the outside, the house looked completely ordinary, just another house in a row in a working-class neighborhood. It fit in perfectly, which was exactly what they intended. Who would ever suspect the horrors hiding behind those plain walls? This outwardly normal appearance was a very important part of their deception, allowing them to carry out their actions for years without suspicion, to invite in victims who suspected nothing, and to keep their growing family trapped within their terrifying secret. And that secret did not take long to become clear within the walls of Cromwell Street. One of the earliest and most chilling examples of abuse involved Anna Maria, Rena's surviving daughter, who was also Fred's stepdaughter and who was living with them. Both Fred and Rose were involved in Anna Maria's abuse. The details are sickening. Anna Maria was subjected to prolonged sexual torture and degradation. This event was a brutal initiation, a dark ritual that firmly established the type of extreme violence and sexual sadism that would become the horrific, everyday routine within the West household. As the years went by, the family got larger, and with that, the nightmare became even worse. Fred and Rose had several children together, including Heather, who was born in 1974, Stephen, also born in 1974, and May, born in 1978, among others. But having children did not make the Wests softer. It only provided more victims, more fuel for their endless cruelty. The children were subjected to a constant stream of physical abuse, sexual violence, and psychological torment from both parents. They were starved, beaten, locked in their rooms, and subjected to unimaginable sexual degradation. Rose was often just as brutal as Fred, if not more so, inflicting severe punishment and actively participating in the sexual abuse of her own children. The outside world saw what appeared to be a large, though somewhat unusual, family. But behind closed doors, these children were living in a living hell, trapped in a cycle of fear and pain, completely at the mercy of their monstrous parents. What happened next is even more disturbing because the evil acts of Fred and Rose were not limited to just their own children or the stepchildren who unfortunately came into their lives. Their intense need for control and violence started to spread outside their house, turning the areas of Gloucester and nearby into their personal hunting grounds. Their method was sneaky and effective, often targeting young, vulnerable women. A seemingly harmless couple driving around, offering a ride to someone walking alone, someone who just needed to get somewhere. This could be a hitchhiker or a young woman leaving a nightclub. Their approach was simple: offer a lift. Fred was often driving, and Rose's presence was very important in this terrible plan. Because, let's be honest, if you are a young woman and you see a man alone in a van offering a ride, you would probably feel nervous. But if there's a woman, another woman, sitting in the passenger seat, that instantly makes the situation feel safer, doesn't it? It makes you less careful. Rose's job was to be the bait, the comforting person who hid the pure evil that was inside Fred and inside herself. They drove around the streets, looking for anyone who seemed alone, anyone who seemed like they wouldn't be missed right away, anyone who could be easily convinced to get into their vehicle. They often went to bus stops, train stations, and places where young people gathered, carefully choosing their victims. And where did these unsuspecting victims often end up? Exactly, back at 25 Cromwell Street, or more specifically, the place that truly became the center of their evil, the cellar. The cellar at Cromwell Street was deliberately changed into a specific place for torture and murder. It was a room of horrors, built for their cruel acts. The Wests developed a horrifyingly effective way to control their victims and make them powerless. They would take their clothes off, tie them up, put something in their mouths to stop any screams from escaping the thick walls, and then subject them to long periods of sexual abuse and torture. One of the most disturbing details that came out of the investigation was their grim practice of removing kneecaps from some of their victims. Why would anyone do that? To prevent them from escaping, of course. To make the victim completely helpless, unable to run away, unable to fight back. While many victims were strangers picked up from the streets, the West's murderous network also trapped those who were closest to them. Consider the tragic situation of Charmaine West. Do you remember her? She was Fred's daughter with his first wife, Rena. Charmaine was only 8 years old when she was murdered. And here is the truly sickening part: it was Rosemary West who killed her. The police would later determine that Rose strangled Charmaine in 1971, and her tiny body was then buried at 25 Midland Road. This event is incredibly important because it clearly showed that Rose was not just an unwilling helper, forced to obey by Fred out of fear. She was a perpetrator herself, capable of the ultimate act of violence, even against a child, even against her stepdaughter. The older daughters, especially Heather and May, lived in a state of constant fear. They knew, without being told, that something was terribly wrong, something truly evil, happening around them. So, in an act of desperate self-preservation, they made an agreement with each other. They promised each other to never be alone with Fred. Think about the heavy emotional burden on children who have to make such a promise to each other just to survive in their own home. However, for Heather, a brave, defiant spirit started to show itself. As she got older, reaching her mid-teens, she began to openly resist her father's abuses. She was more daring, less willing to be a quiet victim. Importantly, she started threatening to tell the police about her father's abuses. This act of defiance, this desperate plea for help, was a direct challenge to Fred's complete control, and tragically, it started the events that would lead directly to her death. In 1987, at the young age of 16, Heather West was murdered by her father, Fred. He killed his own daughter by strangulation. After he had taken her life, something unthinkable happened. Her body was taken to the family bathroom, where, using a serrated knife, Fred dismembered her, and once that gruesome task was finished, her remains were then put into a dustbin, stored for a short time, before being taken out and buried beneath the patio just outside the house. But the horror did not stop there, because Fred and Rose were experts at deceiving people. They immediately made up an elaborate, chillingly believable false story. They told everyone, neighbors, friends, even other family members, that Heather had simply run away. They told a story that she had left home to become a drug dealer, or, even more strangely, that she had moved to the Middle East. They kept up this deceptive story for years whenever anyone asked about Heather. They created the illusion that she was merely a rebellious teenager who had disappeared on her own, effectively erasing her existence, making sure no one would look for her, and ensuring her disappearance for years. This bold, cruel lie allowed them to continue their reign of terror, with Heather's grave lying only a few feet from their kitchen door, a silent, terrible reminder of their unspeakable crimes. We've talked about the truly awful things that happened inside 25 Cromwell Street and how Fred and Rose West expanded their terrible actions beyond their immediate family. That house was like a grave, a living nightmare, and for many years their horrifying secrets stayed hidden, both literally and figuratively. But the truth about complete darkness is that eventually, even a tiny bit of light can show what's there. For the Wests, that light came, as it was bound to, from the very people they had treated so cruelly, their own children. For years, the children of Fred and Rose West lived in an unthinkable state of fear. They were like prisoners in their own home, kept silent by terror and constant manipulation of their minds. Then, a very important turning point happened. The West children were eventually placed in the care of social services. This was a slow, difficult process which happened because of worries raised by schools, relatives, and neighbors who might have seen glimpses of the family's problems. Once they were removed from the immediate, overwhelming, life-threatening presence of their parents, the children finally had a small sense of safety, a little bit of freedom to start dealing with the unspeakable things that had happened. This is when the truth slowly began to come out. Now, the next part sounds almost like something from an old British detective novel, but it is absolutely vital to how this whole terrible story started to become known. This is where the bicycle constable comes in. This was an old-fashioned police officer riding a bicycle, patrolling his area. He met some of the West children who by this time were in care, and they started asking him, in indirect and roundabout ways, about abuse from their father. They didn't directly say, "Our dad murdered people," or "Our parents tortured us." They were still deeply traumatized, still unwilling to directly betray the monstrous secrets they had been forced to keep. But their questions, their hints, and the sheer terror in their eyes when they talked about their father's actions were enough. These indirect questions, these subtle cries for help from deeply damaged children, caused an initial concern within law enforcement and social services. It was enough to make someone pay closer attention, to connect pieces of information that seemed unrelated, and to realize that something profoundly disturbing was happening, or had happened, involving the West family. Following this initial concern, the involvement of Gloucestershire Social Services became direct and firm. Based on the increasing worries and the children's increasingly disturbing revelations, social services took steps to remove 5 of the West children from the household. This was a very significant action, and official. This intervention, while focused on protecting the living children, naturally led to a critical question. What about the oldest child, Heather? She had not been seen for years. Fred and Rose had maintained their elaborate lie about Heather running away to become a drug dealer or moving to the Middle East. But now, with their other children in care and starting to speak, that story began to sound incredibly weak. Social services, working with the police, now had a missing person case on their hands, not just a child welfare issue. The questions about Heather's location became persistent, impossible to avoid, and increasingly direct. The police were no longer just investigating child abuse. They were looking for a teenager who had vanished, and all signs were beginning to point back to 25 Cromwell Street. This brings us to the crucial role played by Constable Hazel Savage. She was an officer who seemed to be low in rank in the overall police structure, but she had a very valuable quality, persistence, and a strong feeling that something was terribly wrong with Fred West. While some of her superiors were doubtful, perhaps even dismissive, after all, Fred West had even been used as a minor informant by the police in the past, which is a chilling detail itself. Constable Savage became more and more convinced that Fred West was responsible for Heather's disappearance. She listened to the children, she put together the pieces of information, and she refused to let the case go. Despite the doubts and the official hurdles, her continuous search for the truth, her firm belief that Heather's disappearance was not her choice, was absolutely crucial. Her persistence finally paid off, allowing her to gather enough information, enough indirect evidence, and enough compelling reasons to finally get the necessary legal permission, a warrant to search the property at 25 Cromwell Street. Without her determination, without her refusal to be stopped by the convenient false story or her colleagues' doubts, the secrets of Cromwell Street might have stayed buried forever. And so, with the warrant in hand, the police arrived at 25 Cromwell Street. The search for Heather West began, and the focus, guided by the children's chilling jokes, was directly on the garden, specifically under the stone patio. A seemingly ordinary suburban garden, with police officers, forensic teams, and digging equipment. The neighbors must have watched, puzzled at first, then increasingly worried as the officers began the careful and thorough process of digging. They started to dig, cautiously and meticulously, beneath the innocent-looking paving stones. This was a targeted search for a missing girl, based on the desperate clues given by her surviving siblings. The ground, which had silently held its gruesome secrets for years, was about to reveal them. And what they would find beneath that patio would not only confirm the worst fears about Heather, but would expose a horror far more extensive and depraved than anyone, even the most suspicious, could have possibly imagined. The awful moment came when the forensic teams found the first human remains under the patio. The initial discovery was broken pieces of a human body, which were later confirmed to be Heather West through dental records and other scientific methods. The immediate realization was clear, horrifying, and absolutely undeniable. This was much bigger than just one missing person. The very organized way the body had been dismembered and buried, how deep the grave was, and the gruesome reality of finding a human being reduced to scattered remains in a suburban garden. It immediately showed that something deeply evil was going on. The professionals on site knew with a chilling certainty that this was only the beginning. The discovery of Heather's remains confirmed the terrible whispered truths the children had told and shattered the West's years-long deception. But it also raised a terrifying question. If Heather was here, who else might be? As the digging continued and the first body was being identified, Fred West was, of course, a main person in the investigation. When the police first talked to him about Heather's disappearance and the ongoing search, he immediately tried to avoid answering and deny everything. He was clever and manipulative, and at first, he tried to keep up his carefully built appearance of being an ordinary, though troubled father. He made up stories, pretended not to know anything, and even tried to blame others. A particularly chilling detail was how he insisted that Rose knew nothing about Heather's murder. He tried to protect her, or maybe to protect their twisted partnership, by taking all the blame for that specific crime himself. He kept up this elaborate lie, but the growing evidence from the ongoing digging was impossible to deny. As the search continued, as more and more horrifying clues came out of the ground, Fred's calm began to break. He first made a partial admission to killing Heather, a confession that he later, as expected, tried to take back when the digging got more intense and, for a short time, no more bodies were immediately found. He was playing a twisted game, trying to control the story, to make the true scale of his wickedness seem smaller, even as the truth literally came out of the ground beneath his feet. He was trying to mislead the police, to buy himself time, to cause doubt, anything to keep his control. But the ground and the persistent investigators would not be fooled. The investigation quickly went beyond the patio, reaching the very core of the house, the cellar of 25 Cromwell Street. And what they found there was unbelievable. They discovered 6 more bodies buried beneath the cellar floor, 6 more victims, 6 more lives brutally ended, buried under a space where children innocently played. The sheer number of findings within the house itself was shocking, a horrifying testament to the West's frequent and organized killing spree. Each discovery brought a new wave of shock and disgust, not only for the investigators, but for the entire community. The house was not just a home, it was a place of death, a hidden cemetery where the victims had been brutally killed and then hidden just feet below the living areas, a truly horrifying proof of the depth of their wickedness. The police knew, based on the sheer number of victims found and on Fred's earlier movements, that the house could not be the only burial place. They started to expand their investigation, looking at other properties where Fred West had lived and the remote areas he often visited. This led them back to Much Marcle, near Fred's childhood home in Herefordshire. This was a difficult search. These were open fields, remote, vast, and hard to navigate. But the police's perseverance paid off. After a great deal of effort, digging in the fields led to the grim but necessary discovery of Rena Costello and Anne McFall's bodies. These were the earliest known victims, the ones from Fred's initial series of crimes before he met Rose. Finding these remains required huge effort, advanced forensic techniques, and a steady commitment to bringing every victim home. It completed a terrifying circle, connecting Fred's earliest crimes to his later, more extensive partnership with Rose. This wider search confirmed what many had feared. Fred West's crimes spanned decades and multiple locations, but 25 Cromwell Street was clearly the central point of his later, most brutal actions. With the horrifying discoveries increasing, it was only a matter of time before Rosemary West was brought in. She was arrested, and from the very beginning, her behavior was chillingly consistent. She immediately denied everything. She claimed she had never seen the victims found at Cromwell Street. She stated that Fred had forbidden her from going into the cellar, portraying herself as an unknowing, perhaps even terrified, observer. She told a story of being a victim herself, controlled and manipulated by Fred. This was her defense, her attempt to distance herself from the unspeakable acts that had happened in her own home. But her public statements and her firm denials were in sharp contrast to the growing evidence of her direct involvement. The children's statements, the forensic evidence, the patterns of abuse, all pointed to her active participation, her willing involvement, and in some cases, her starting of horrific acts. She was not just someone who allowed it. She was a perpetrator, a key player in the House of Horrors. Then, the investigation took an unexpected, dramatic turn. On January 1st, 1995, while waiting for his trial for his horrific crimes, Fred West took his own life in prison. He was found hanged in his cell at Winson Green Prison in Birmingham. This act had immediate and serious consequences for the ongoing investigation and the legal process. His death meant that the full truth, the complete list of victims, and perhaps the full extent of Rose's involvement, would never be definitively gotten from him. It took away from the victims' families the chance for a trial, the opportunity to see him face justice in court. Most importantly, his death left Rose to face all the accusations alone. With Fred gone, she could no longer hide behind his shadow, no longer push the blame onto him as the only person responsible for the atrocities. The focus was now entirely on her, and she would have to answer for her part in the unspeakable horrors of 25 Cromwell Street. The trial of Rosemary West was, as you can imagine, one of the most sensational and horrifying legal events in British history. It started on October 3, 1995, at Winchester Crown Court, only a few months after Fred's suicide. Rose was charged with 10 murders, a shockingly high number that immediately cemented her place in the dark history of true crime. Her defense team, even with the overwhelming evidence, tried to create a very specific picture. Their main argument, the core of their defense, was that Rose was nothing more than a victim herself, completely controlled by Fred. They claimed she was terrified of him, practically a prisoner in her own home, and therefore had no knowledge of the horrific murders, let alone participated in them. She kept a calm, almost defiant manner throughout the proceedings, often appearing disconnected from the grim testimony being presented. Rose continued to firmly deny knowing anything about the victims, especially those found at 25 Cromwell Street and other locations. She stuck to her story that Fred had forbidden her from entering the cellar and that she was unaware of the bodies buried beneath her patio and within the very foundations of her home. However, the prosecution, led by Brian Levison QC, presented an absolutely overwhelming case against her. They carefully laid out the chilling evidence piece by painstaking piece that clearly showed Rose's direct, active, and often enthusiastic involvement in the torture, rape, and murder of the victims. This was not just about the forensic evidence from the graves, which was damning enough. This also included the testimonies of the surviving children, who were now able to speak freely about the unspeakable acts they had witnessed and endured. They detailed Rose's participation, her cruelty, and how she initiated abuse. There were also statements from other witnesses who had seen Rose with the victims, or who could confirm her involvement. The court heard how she helped lure young women, how she participated in their torture, and how she was often as brutal, if not more so, than Fred himself. The prosecution argued convincingly that Rose was not a timid victim but a willing and active partner in their shared cruelty. They presented evidence of her sexually abusing her own children and other young women, demonstrating her independent ability to commit monstrous acts. The jury heard about how meticulously the crimes were planned, the systematic abuse, and the cold way they got rid of bodies. After a difficult trial that lasted for 6 weeks, the jury went to discuss their decision. And on November 22, 1995, they returned with their verdict. The jury found Rosemary West guilty on 10 counts of murder. This conviction was a landmark moment, establishing her as one of Britain's most prolific female serial killers. She was sentenced to 10 life sentences, with the recommendation that she never be released. This essentially means she will die in prison. Despite the overwhelming verdict and the large amount of evidence, Rose continued, and still continues to this day, to refuse to cooperate with police inquiries regarding other possible victims. There have always been suspicions that the Wests were responsible for more murders than those for which they were convicted, but Rose's firm silence, her refusal to provide any further information, means that many questions remain unanswered, and the full extent of their evil may never truly be known. She has maintained her claim of innocence, even from prison, but the court of law and the general public found her clearly guilty. With the legal proceedings finished, at least for Rose, and with the full, horrifying truth of 25 Cromwell Street openly revealed for everyone to see, a decision was made about the physical place where their crimes occurred. In October 1996, a little less than a year after Rose's conviction, the infamous house at 25 Cromwell Street was torn down. The community of Gloucester, and indeed the wider public, had a collective, desperate wish to remove the physical reminder of the terrible acts committed there. The house had become a disturbing sight for some, a place of morbid interest, but for most, especially the families of the victims and the traumatized residents of the area, it was a constant, unbearable symbol of unspeakable evil. Every brick, every window, every part of that structure seemed to call out the names of the dead. The site was later turned into a landscaped area, a quiet, empty space where a house of horrors once stood.